Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming, if you can make it here in person, and thanks to all the people online for being here online. So I'm going to keep my part very short. I just want to introduce Paul. Paul is the former director for FEMA Region 7. He's been a very good friend of mine and a mentor for the last several years. Really happy that he made the trip up. Thank you very much for coming. Paul's going to talk a lot about today the importance of public-private collaboration during disasters. And he has a lot of great information. Where'd Jay go? There he is. Jay, would you raise your hand for a second? Jay is also the new director for Safeguard Iowa Partnership. I just wanted to introduce Jay as a person that if you're with the private businesses here in Iowa, this is a way for, it's kind of the conduit for helping those private businesses get into a lot of the things that Paul's going to talk about with that public-private collaboration and how you get involved in response to those disasters and do it in a way that's coordinated. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Paul, thank you again very much for coming, and I'll get your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Well, it's thank you, Dutch. Thanks, AJ, for the invitation. I drove up from Kansas City today. That's where my home is. But just a little bit of background. I'm retired from the military, primarily 23 years in the Army. And in various jobs, operations, logistics. But then after I retired, I had an opportunity to work with FEMA in Kansas City. And I was the FEMA Regional Administrator for Region 7, which of course covers Iowa and then Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. So I spent about 4 years doing that during the last administration. And then since then, I have my own consulting business, working not just in emergency management, but also working with a variety of defense companies, and I do government relations as well. So really specific to my experience, having been brought up in the DoD and the DHS world now with FEMA. One of the things that I spent a lot of time doing in FEMA was talking about the inclusion of the private sector into emergency management, response, and preparedness. It was a passion of mine, and I think that there's, a lot has happened nationally and also in the region over the last, as I've watched it over the last 5 or 6 years, but we still have a long way to go, I think, because the one thing that everyone in this room doesn't need me to tell them is that there's a lot of disaster business, right? You only have to go to one of the many, many emergency management conferences and see the amount of companies that are trying to cash in on the emergency management business to understand that there are more and more disasters. Disasters are getting bigger and bigger and more expensive. And the state, local, state, and FEMA cannot do it by themselves, right? We have amazing people at the local and the state level. I think FEMA, I think that everyone always has, mixed minds about the value that FEMA provides. I'm a FEMA guy, so I think that FEMA is a great organization as long as we focus on the things that we're good at FEMA. And lots of times we kind of lose sight. We try to do too much. FEMA, I think, is one of the big things. When in reality, we should be super focused on providing the financial support to state and local governments that they need to respond to and recover from disasters and prepare, instead of kind of getting into the mix further than that. But I'm happy to answer questions about that. We're going to talk a little bit about private sector. But the reality is, this time is yours, right? I've only got like 4 or 5 slides. We can get through those pretty quick. And then, I'm happy to answer questions about my experience at FEMA or anything else that you want to talk about. But it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just quickly, one of the things that I will say is that groups like this are really encouraging. I was telling AJ and Dutch that, lots of times we try to put a label on things. We have COADs, FOADs, long-term planning committees, right? It really doesn't matter what it's called, or even if it's just a lunch and learn every month. The value to local partnerships, not just in the government world, not just in the nonprofit world, but bringing all of those players together. And then also other influencers like governmental decision makers, county, city, right? Police, fire, and then also the private sector, right? Because we all have a stake in when something happens in this community. If something happens in Des Moines, it's not just the local emergency management agency that has a stake, right? It's everybody that lives here. It's everybody that has a business here. It's everyone that lives here. So the more aligned we are and the more we talk to each other and cross-fertilize ideas like you're doing in this room, the better off we will be when disaster strikes. So I really would commend all of you all for being willing to engage, and obviously AJ and Dutch for kind of setting up this mechanism so that you have a chance to talk about things informally, because it's really going to make the difference. It does make the difference. It's not going to when something bad happens, right? Okay, let me see if I got this liquor thing. Does that work?
You want to just yell at me?
Sure. Okay. So, you know, the thing that I found about emergency management is that oftentimes we look at the private sector very linearly, right? What can the private sector do for me during a disaster, right? Lots of times that's the way FEMA looks at the private sector nationwide, right? We have a big event. What do we need in terms of resources that the private sector can donate to us, right? We need people. We need volunteers. We need water. We need food, right? We need fuel. And lots of times the private sector does step up in a big way via, you know, sort of a philanthropic perspective to the private sector, right? We want to do good just because we have the resources to be able to do that. But there's so many more reasons why the private sector should think about emergency management, not just in the response, but also in the preparedness phases. You know, the first thing is businesses have to operate. You know, you're in business to make money, right? So any interruption to your business means that you are losing money. So even if you don't care about what's happening around you and there's no altruistic perspective, a business should be involved and think about emergency management, or it doesn't matter whether you call it business continuity or emergency management, right? A business should be engaged because you want to protect your revenue. You want to protect and preserve your business operations to make sure that there is no interruption to critical business functions. So it behooves a business to think through the process of making sure that they can continue their essential functions, right? If you study continuity and you take any commercially available continuity course, or the courses, FEMA has a lot of continuity courses that you could take. They talk about continuity as the preservation or the restoration of essential functions, right? And that's really from a purely a business perspective. Businesses have to look at that and say, okay, how am I going to protect myself from a risk so that I can continue running my business? And also, how am I going to recover as fast as I can so that I can continue generating revenue, right? And get up and running as fast as possible. So from a business perspective, that's got to be the number one priority, I would think, if I was a business owner, right? The second thing is businesses have employees, right? And if you're a business in the Des Moines area, right, and you employ any number of people, I would think that you would want to be concerned about emergency management because your people live in this community and they may be affected by disasters too, right? So you have a dual responsibility as a business owner when a disaster happens, because you not only have to worry about what's happening to your business, but what about if you run a plant and you have 100 people working there, maybe you're working split shifts. What about those 100 people? Are they disaster survivors, right? Can they come to work? Right? Are their homes affected? Are their families affected? Right? So, you know, I would hope that most businesses would be concerned about their employees, right? But also that's a cause for concern for the business because, you know, your ability to operate depends on employee availability, right? So employee safety is a big reason why you want to be engaged in emergency management. Interestingly, there was a study done a long time ago, and when I was at FEMA, I tried to find the actual original study. But one of the problems, you know, I'm sure guys like AJ, you know, when you're in the emergency management business, right? You think about preparedness all the time and how hard it is to convince the public to be prepared for a disaster, right? You do preparedness fairs and, you do all these kinds of events to try to get people to, make sure they've got, a shelter in place plan, emergency kits, right? They've documented, out in the hallway, there's 12 steps to emergency preparedness, right? But the reality is how many people actually take that seriously and do it? Preparedness is a hard sell, right? When a disaster is not staring somebody in the face. But what this study looked at is that they looked at businesses that had defined continuity plans where employees were briefed and the plan was communicated to employees. And they found out that almost over 90% of those employees also went home and started developing their own personal preparedness plans for themselves and their family. So there's a trickle down effect for what businesses do in terms of looking out for their businesses and their employees, but then having a greater impact in the community when those employees go home and they start to think about those same problems for their household, right? Or their extended household. It's hard to put a number on that. And that's why I was interested that there was actually a study that looked at that, but very interesting. And, it makes logical sense. And so we knew at FEMA, and I'm sure every state and local EMA, if we get businesses involved and to thinking about emergency management and they involve their employees, then it's a twofer, right? We're not just going to make sure businesses are well prepared, but we're going to make sure that more people in the community are prepared too. The thing is that businesses are community leaders, right? So there is a role for them to play during all phases of emergency management, just because you care about Des Moines, right? Or whatever community that you live in, right? And so, much like a government, an appointed official or an elected official, if you run a company, right, you have a leadership role in that community. And after a disaster, we need all the leaders that we can get our hands on, right, to take up arms and kind of get us through that response phase into the recovery phase as fast as possible. The last thing is that a lot of our businesses represent some type of critical infrastructure, right? And that's where the government really does get engaged in terms of outreach with businesses, because if you're a utility, right, could be a public sector organization, but it also could be private. If you're a utility, you're running a business, but that is absolutely critical from a governmental emergency management perspective to be able to restore service or maintain service for water, for electricity, for those things, right? So the government has a vested interest in working with the private sector to make sure that we maintain those services during a disaster. Like I said, if you're one of those, if you've studied, if AJ, have you socialized lifelines at all with everybody? A little bit. So FEMA talks about lifelines, right? And they talk about all those essential services and functions that have to be, restored or performed during the response phase of a disaster. A lot of those lifelines focus on utilities and other public, private infrastructure that has to be restored. Cell service, right? The minute you lose cell service, it seems like the dominoes fall pretty quickly on everything else, right? Because if you can't talk, it gets pretty difficult. So, but FEMA has a lot of actually institutional knowledge, as does an organization called CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also a DHS entity, into working with businesses that represent critical infrastructure and making sure that we can protect those. And not just protect them, but recover as quickly as possible and get those services up and running following a disaster. So, and I will say too, if there are questions, I don't know online if they can chat you or or if you have questions as we go along, please just raise your hand and we will take the time to answer those things. I'm happy to go down the rabbit hole with you if you got something on your mind. And Dutch, I'm sorry, asked you to do that, and I need to go to the next slide. You know, the other thing I will say too is that, you know, on the last slide is, frankly, you don't need to go back, Dutch, but, you know, frankly, disasters represent business opportunities for a lot of companies as well, right? And it doesn't make them, you know, dirty, mud-sucking, you know, companies. You know, if you're a company that provides debris removal, right? Or can provide resources like water or food. You know, those are opportunities to engage with the emergency management sector before a disaster. So then as soon as things happen, you might have a pre-event contract written up with the county or with the state that you can execute as soon as something happens. And that way, you know, that's good for the business. It's good for the community as well, because you're going to be able to get a hold of those resources faster, right? So I think lots of times we, you know, especially us in government, you know, I say us still, but, you know, the folks in government emergency management, you know, we kind of tend to keep contractors at arm's length, right? You know, because they're just looking to sell us something. But the reality is a lot of them are selling something that you're going to need during a disaster, right? So, you know, you have a responsibility to vet those folks, make sure they're good. But the reality is if you can have a relationship with those companies and even going so far as to have pre-event contracts in place, that's going to help out quite a bit. It'll help your speed of response. So if you're a business, and you know, I realize that not everyone here it represents a private sector interest, you know, but I think a lot of these things, you know, cut across the majority of organizations. But if you don't know where to start to get prepared, right, or to enter this community, you know, there's a couple places, right? And you know, the first thing is you talk to your local emergency manager, obviously, right? And they can figure out how to get you plugged in. You know, Jay's here, Safeguard Iowa, right? I've got them listed up there. Got the logo, but you know, if you're a private sector entity or some other organization, joining a public-private partnership like Safeguard Iowa makes a lot of sense, right? There's training that you can get. You're in the community, right? In terms of information flow at that point. So you're going to have a lot better information when a disaster happens by being part of that group instead of just sort of being alone out there, right? And trying to get information once a bad event happens. But it all starts, you know, everything in emergency management starts with hazards, right? What is the risk, right? And businesses think about risk a little bit differently, I think, but it's the same concept, right? So, you know, flooding risk, right? I spent enough time on the ground in Des Moines looking at flood damage, right? Or looking at derecho, you know, wind damage, to know, you know, there are normal or winter storm damage. Those are the normal things that emergency managers think about in terms of risks, right? Cyber threat.
You're here for the lunch and learn?
Right now.
Next meeting?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
I thought they might have had a question. Okay. You know, business, there's also risks that are different for businesses, right? Because not being able to perform your essential functions and not being able to continue business operations, anything that interrupts that is a risk for a business, right? So losing power, right? Even if it's a localized power outage, might not be, you know, it might be on, you know, Dutch's radar, right? Or the Polk County EMA's radar a little bit. But a localized power outage probably isn't going to rise to the level of visibility. Power company's going to work on it, right? We're going to get through it. But to a business that can't operate because they don't have any power, right? That's a huge risk because there's a big impact, right? So businesses have to go one step further. And, you know, it's pretty easy to kind of think about, okay, yeah, winter storms, flooding, you know, am I in a floodplain? You know, is my facility flood proof, that kind of thing. But thinking about all those other risks, you know, a cyber attack on a business that shuts down your email, right? Or a lack of cell coverage for whatever reason, right, is a big deal to a company that's operating. Right? Say you're a sales company, you're selling nationwide, and you can't have people on the phones for a week, right? Think about the lost revenue that's involved with not being able to do that. So you have to take a hard look at your risks. I think that's the first step to everything. And then, of course, once you properly identified your risks, then you can start developing a deliberate plan to mitigate those risks, or respond to them if something happens. There's a lot of resources that are out there in terms of business continuity. Two of the best actually are FEMA, CISA, I already mentioned, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has invested a significant amount into readiness and emergency preparedness. In fact, the guy from FEMA that used to work on private sector integration across the country and ran the National Business Emergency Operations Center at FEMA is now working for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So if you went to their website, you would find a lot of great information about business continuity. So there's not even the National Fire Protection Association, right? Ready.gov from FEMA, the Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, is a great organization that has a lot of resources that you can go to. And if you just don't, if you're a business owner, right? Or if you're a government agency and a business comes up to you and says, I just don't know where to start, you can start pointing them in the direction of some of these resources, right? Go ahead.
Paul, if you don't mind, just a quick plug for the U.S. Chamber.
Yeah.
After Hurricane Ian down in Florida, what's that been, maybe not 2 months ago, we received a lot of questions about how to engage with providing services or products that might be needed after the hurricane. And just the timing was really good that we got a notification of a conference call that the U.S. Chamber hosted. And I think Jay was on that, maybe some of the others were. Just excellent, providing situational awareness, how to get further plugged into that community that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
So yeah, they did a great job after the hurricane.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. FEMA, actually, they produce lots. I mean, they're like any big government agency, right? I mean, they can stack the paper that they produce by the foot, right? But that guide, Building Public-Private Partnerships, is one of the more useful things that I've seen FEMA produce, right? There's actually useful guidance in there, right? And references that a business could use. There's also a certification, continuity practitioner certification that you can get through FEMA that costs nothing, right? It's all independent study and classes that you could take online or at the Emergency Management Institute for free, right? So if you're a business and you don't have an emergency manager or you don't have someone responsible for business continuity, one, you need somebody to wear that hat, right? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Two, if you have somebody that doesn't know anything about it and wants to get started, that's a place that you can point them to. A lot of free training online. And of course, there's lots of private sector training that you can do. There's a company called DRI that does business continuity training for a living. You get a certification. It's all kind of, you pay to take class, you take a test, you get a certification. All those things are, some value to that, right? Public-private partnerships, and I already kind of stole the thunder on this, but, states that have good organizations that do this are light years ahead of other states, right? Listen, I'm amongst friends, right? But, I used to represent 4 states when I worked for FEMA. 2 of them had good, solid public-private partnerships. Iowa, Safeguard Iowa, and Nebraska, the Nebraska Preparedness Partnership, right? 2 states did not, right? And so whenever there was a big event in those other 2 states, they struggled with private sector integration, right? They struggled much less than Nebraska and Iowa, right? Now, they're still good people, right? And they have relationships in a lot of those different critical infrastructure sectors, right? And they get the job done. But having, there's only about really, I think, a fifth of the states out there have some type of public-private partnership, right? It might not even be statewide, but it might be like the biggest city might have one that kind of extends out to the state. But y'all are really lucky in Iowa to have a group like Safeguard Iowa. So that's my plug. Join the organization, okay? You'll get a lot out of it. We mentioned the National Chamber. One of the things that I wish I could have been more successful in when I was at FEMA was engaging with all of the larger chambers in the region, right? Des Moines Chamber of Commerce, right? Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. We did do some work with Kansas City. I met with a few other chambers, but it really, really does make sense for a chamber to have some type of business continuity or emergency management working group on the chamber, right? Where you ask chamber members to sit on that working group as a volunteer position and talk about ways that, the chamber can help bring resources in to help companies with business continuity. It's kind of a tough sell, right? It seems like you're just asking them to do something else, right? But for the people in this room or online that might be connected to the chamber, right? I think there's a lot, you can get a lot done by engaging and finding ways to bring people together through existing organizations like chambers, right? Obviously, if you're familiar with the co-ed concept, community organizations active in disaster, long-range planning communities have different groups that bring people in, sort of like this, right? Not as lunch and learns, but other opportunities. All of those things are good ways to get involved. Exercises are a great way, right? Most of the time, emergency management agencies are looking for people to get engaged with exercises, right? They can't find enough people. So if your business wants to be included as a volunteer, as a role player in some fashion, you're going to learn a lot about what's going on and what your role might need to be during emergency management. And then, ask what your employees want to do. Right? That's the thing I always say. Sometimes employees might want to join a CERT team, right? Or your company might want to sponsor a CERT team in the community, right? So that if something happened and your business wasn't interrupted and you had the opportunity to cut those 10 or 15 people go for a little bit, you had to sort of think about how cool that would be. If a business had a CERT team working with the local EMA, that they could just unplug and volunteer that time over 3 or 4 days to help a community respond to a disaster. That would be super cool. I haven't seen it. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist out there. Okay, and let's see. The title on this slide is actually called Be Prepared, right? Oh, not that one. Sorry. And we already talked about, we're all in the risk management business, right? It doesn't matter whether you're managing business risk, right? Operations risk, whether you're managing risk as a government agency, an emergency management agency, but we all get paid to some extent to think about, okay, what are the risks in front of me? And how am I going to, first, how am I going to mitigate them to make sure that they don't affect me? Or how am I going to deal with them? How am I going to respond to them when those risks happen, right? And so we're all, it doesn't matter whether you're in the risk business at your house and you're thinking, okay, we're coming up on winter, it's time to winterize my house because there are risks involved with cold weather in Iowa, right? Which is, I'm surprised it's taken this long to have, a lot of cold weather in Iowa. Or whether you're a business owner or whatnot, right? And so you have to think about physical, cyber, business revenue loss. We talked about all that. Employee health and safety, right? We talked a lot about employee health and safety during COVID. During COVID, one of the things I'll remember for the rest of my life was being the lead federal coordinator for this region for COVID, right? Every day it was something new. And yet it still seemed like Groundhog Day, day after day for, a year and a half when we were at least, and it was still going on when I left FEMA, obviously, it's still going on today. But we talked a lot about what are the things that a government agency can do or a business can do to protect its employees, because people started getting really uncomfortable. They started getting really familiar with the whole idea that my business, depends on the availability of my employees, right? And when you have 10 employees out sick or, quarantining for COVID, things get froggy for a business, right? When a school is missing 20 teachers because they're out for COVID, right? What do? Right? So you have to think about employee health and safety as a risk. There are risks associated with that. And certainly infectious disease and pandemic, even if you're going into flu season, you have to think about what's going to happen during flu season, right? Am I going to bring in somebody to get flu shots? Because maybe that'll mean less employees will get sick and I'll be able to weather that storm, or am I just going to take the chance, right? Am I going to think about clean air, right? That's one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing because I have a client that works in that space. But thinking about, we know that infectious disease is largely, after 2.5 years of dealing with this, is all about indoor air quality, right? We didn't think about that 2.5 years ago. We thought you could get COVID because, by putting your hand on the surface, right? We know that's not the case anymore. We know it's about what you breathe in, right? And it's not just about COVID, it's also about flu, it's about cold, it's about the next thing. So how, is my HVAC running up to speed, right? Am I using HEPA filtering or some other type of technology to make sure that I have the cleanest air possible at my school, in my EOC, for my employees in a business? But employee health and safety is certainly a concern. And then, there's a whole bunch of things that you want to think about in terms of being able to mitigate those risks, right? Communication, I'll skip to that one for right now, and information. If there's a flood and your building is not accessible because of that flood, right? What is your plan to inform your employees about what's happening and whether they need to come to work today or not, right? How do employees get information? How do you get information about what's going on during a disaster? Are you blowing up AG's cell phone? Because I guarantee that's not what he wants, right? But what is the mechanism that the county uses to disseminate information to the private sector? And how does the private sector get plugged into that, right? So that when something happens, you're receiving the best and most current information about what's happening, right? And how you can plug in what you need to do, because you have a responsibility to continue running your business, but also being able to communicate to your employees about what's happening, right? And what they need to do to continue to preserve as much business essential functions as possible within your business. So how are you going to communicate? What if you lose cell phone coverage, right? Do you have email distros that go out to all the employees, right? Things that you can think about now. The company that I worked in, a lot of much younger folks, they had a group me for the whole company, which makes guys like me super uncomfortable, because that's just a new thing that I don't want to learn. But for all of them, that's how they communicated, right? And it was actually an incredibly effective way of getting the word out to all of the employees, because they've all got a phone. They also had Teams on their phone, and they did Teams messaging, right? And put everybody into a group, everybody in the company, and they would send messages to people. But you have to think about, what are those mechanisms that I'm going to use to communicate during a disaster to my employees, to local emergency management, right? To your customers, to your suppliers, right? Because if you have a customer and they're calling and they're not getting an answer, they don't necessarily know that you got hit by a disaster. I mean, they might see it on the national news, but they don't know. What's your plan to outreach to those folks? And speaking about suppliers, supply chain disruptions are a big, big thing. And that goes back up to risk management in the private sector. Because, an impact to the supply chain is a huge impact to you and your customers and your ability to continue to earn revenue. I got a daughter going to college next year. We just bought her car, got the car, and they said, okay, we're giving you this brand new car, Chevy Trailblazer, right? She loves it, except there's 4 computer chips that are missing from the car right now. And don't worry, we'll call you when we get them in, right? Guess what? It's been 6 months. They ain't ever called me. I called them the other day. They said, don't worry, you're going to get a letter from Chevy saying, when you get your chips. And you don't get the chips, we'll get the chips and we'll call you. I said, sounds like a lot like checks in the mail, right? I don't know when she'll ever have her seat warmers, right? But it's important to her, not as important to me. But you know, supply chain disruption, right? And that you just had to now have a upset customer because I bought a car 6 months ago. You told me you're getting these chips in, and now I don't know when, you know, we're going to get them in. So you have to be able to manage supply chain disruption. I mean, think about, I hesitate to even say this, but think about March of 2020 and how difficult it was to get PPE, right, during COVID, right? I mean, that in itself, I don't necessarily blame, well, I don't know, maybe there's some blame to go around. HHS and FEMA about availability, but all that was a supply chain problem, right? There are still big companies making N95 masks, right? They just happen to all be in China, right? But, you know, the ability to get those things, those are problems that we need to solve and we can think through, right? And because the reality is the pandemic strategy for the United States was never about a national pandemic, right? It was about a small pandemic or a pandemic that breaks out regionally. You contain it, prevent it from going to the rest of the country, and then you mass resources from the rest of the country to that one place, right? So we had enough resources. We had these strategic reserves of PPE and all the things that you would need, but it was never enough for an entire country, right? There's no amount that you could prepo that would be enough for an entire country. But in that case, now, you got to think about the possibility of that happening again, unfortunately. And how are we going to preserve that supply chain? Because if you're not keeping it on hand and storing it, right, then you have to be able to deliver that stuff just in time when people need it. And that's really difficult, especially when you're talking about everything comes on literally a slow boat from China, right? And that's what FEMA, I don't know if you know this, but that's what FEMA actually ended up doing. We didn't necessarily seize those goods and take them for a public good. But one of the first things that FEMA did was they started telling all these companies that were producing masks in China that they would use air assets that they could commandeer from the federal government. And we would start flying those supplies to the US instead of putting them on a ship, right? Because a ship to travel from China to the US was like 2 weeks and a plane was like 12 hours, right? So we could get them into the public that much quicker by increasing the transportation, increasing the transportation time, right? Or decreasing the transportation time, right? Mutual aid, right? Who can you depend on during a disaster, right? I just had a conversation with, I don't know if any of you know Cole Bisgard from IV, right? He's the emergency manager for IV. And great guy, right? But we were talking about one of the strengths of Hy-Vee is that if they do get hit in one place, right, even regionally, they always have this workforce that's available, right, from other Hy-Vee stores outside of the affected area that they can bring in, right, to help with emergency management functions and disaster relief. So that we typically talk about mutual aid as like government to government, right? A county, an adjacent county helping out a neighbor county, right? Another state sending emergency management personnel in to help an affected state. But mutual aid doesn't have to be government to government. Mutual aid can be, within your own business structure, right? If you're postured all over the state, and if you're a bank and you have a business interruption with 4 of your branches, right? Well, guess what? You have people and resources that are available, not just to do that work, but also maybe pick up the slack and continue operations for those other branches until those other ones come back online, right? So you need to think about what tools are in your disposal, what mutual assets are out there that you can use to help. And then of course, classically mutual aid is important, right? We talk all the time about that, the emergency management community. Who's available to help? Redundant power, right? I don't have to tell anybody in Iowa about redundant power and backup generators. It is the number one requested resource after a disaster, right? Generators, right? And when there's a big hurricane somewhere, you can't get enough generators. But it's also one of the easiest things to make sure that you have enough backup power at your facility during a blue sky day, right? A day when nothing's going on, to make sure that you're prepared, right? It's also one of the easiest assets to have at your house to make sure that you have power. I covet one of those F-150 Lightnings, right? Because I heard that, you know, not only do I drive an F-150 and I for sure can't afford one of these things, but I heard that you could power your whole house indefinitely off of this system that they have on the F-150 Lightning. That's pretty cool. Especially for the emergency management person inside of me, right? But, you know, it is amazing the power requirements that we have when power is actually one of the things that is easiest to fix. It takes money, right? But it's easy to be prepared for a power interruption by building in generators into your building plan or, you know, portable generators. If you're a business, you maintain a lot of data, right? So what happens if you lose access to that data? Not no one, right? There are certainly people that are still running a lot of hard copy documentation in their businesses, right? But if you can't access that or those are destroyed, what's your backup plan, right? Like if your building's flooded out and you stored all those, you know, file cabinets down in the basement, and they all got flooded and you lost all those paper, shame on you, first of all, right? But like, what's your plan? Like how can you duplicate those records, or are they just lost? Now, most companies are getting pretty tech savvy, right? And most records are digital, right? But are you maintaining local digital, right? Or are you storing them in the cloud, right? Most people are moving to the cloud. But again, you know, what if you lose internet access? Right? If you lose internet access, you just lost access to all of your operating data and documents that you need to run your company. So what's the backup plan, right? Do you have hotspots that you can use, right? Can you provide backup power? All those things are going to allow you to continue to talk, to access the internet, right? To access your digital files. Insurance. It's a hard thing to talk about, especially with people that think they can't afford insurance, and insurance is another cost. But if you're a business, for sure you have to look at insurance as one of the number one ways to reduce your revenue loss following a disaster, right? You have to look at your risks, and then you have to be insured appropriately. You know, and your average homeowner, I wish they would do that too. Right? We spent a lot of time in FEMA preaching about flood insurance and other kind of risk insurance, right? If you live in southeast Missouri, you want to talk about earthquake, right? But, you know, I understand that for a family, for a household, insurance is largely about cost, right? And whether you think that you can bear that cost and is it worth the expense? But to a business, right, you have to build that into your budget, right? Because it will make it much easier to recover if you've got an insurance settlement coming in to help you rebuild and recover from that event. And then, of course, exercise. No, you know, I feel lots of times, you know, like I'm still in FEMA and, you know, or any emergency management agency, you preach a lot about this stuff. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't, but no plan is good sitting on a shelf, right? No plan, even if you say you walk out of here and you're a business with 100 employees and you decide, yeah, I really do need to think about this, right? We got flooded out 2 years ago, and I really need to think about how I can get engaged with business continuity. You take one of your smart employees and you say, hey, I want you to get into this, right? And they check out all the resources. They joined Safeguard Iowa, right? And we're really cruising along. We got a plan, right? We write this exhaustive continuity plan, but if it stops there, it doesn't do any good. You know, that plan has to be communicated to the employees so they know what to do when something happens, right? We talked about communication, but then you need to exercise it, right? You need to exercise it internally, but you also need to be part of the community exercise plan too. which I'm sure, you know, guys like Polk County EMA can help you with as well. Yes, sir.
How do you, or did you at FEMA, I'm talking about personal insurance
Yeah.
for homes. As we've tried to help organizations, a lot of their employees say, well, I know I'm underinsured, but the government will come in and bail me out the way they do on the other poor people. And, you know, so I'm just not gonna spend that money.
Yeah.
How do you sort of combat that, or can you?
Yeah. Well, I think that you talk about it a lot,
Sure.
but the reality is that it takes an event to convince people. You know, listen, there's a lot of people in Des Moines, right, that have been affected by disasters, and some, because the reality is that, you know, if you're not insured, right, then you become eligible for, you know, individual assistance potentially from FEMA if individual assistance is authorized by the president. But the most assistance that a homeowner is going to get is something like $14,000 for the individual assistance program. And that's the high end, right? Some might only get a couple $1,000s. You think about it, if you have significant damage to your home from flooding, you're not going to do anything with that money, right? So unfortunately, what you have to do is tell people, like, there's a real risk analysis that you have to do related to flood insurance specifically, but any kind of, you know, insurance for your home, fire, you know, earthquake, like I talked about, hurricane is big, you know, down in the southeast part of the country. And the question is, you have to ask yourself, can you recover? Can you rebuild your home if you only had $5,000 in your pocket from the federal government, right? And the answer is obviously no, right? So you got to look at insurance. But I say that, and you know, I also know that studies tell us that for about 1 or 2 weeks after a disaster, people are really focused on looking at insurance, and then once it's over, even the people that had their homes affected by a disaster don't care anymore. It's rough. It's really rough. People should be insured. I know it's an out-of-pocket cost that a lot of people can't afford, right? You know, I mean, the reality is that lots of times, in order to get a federally backed mortgage, FEMA is going to tell you you have to, you know, if you live in a floodplain, you're going to have to, you know, get flood insurance. But, you know, we used to talk all the time, you know, really, if it rains, it floods, right? You don't have to live in a floodplain. I mean, just during my short time at FEMA, I've seen plenty of homes completely destroyed by floods that weren't anywhere near a floodplain. So that made me go home and get a flood policy on my house, right? I don't live in a floodplain, but I said, one, I'm the FEMA administrator. If somebody asked me if I have flood insurance, I better probably say yes, right? But two, it's just good policy, right? And the reality is, you know, if you don't live in a floodplain and there's not, at least from the government perspective, an active risk there, it's pretty affordable, right? But listen, you know, if we didn't make you get car insurance, nobody would have car insurance probably. It's just an expensive amounts. I appreciate the question though.
Yeah, they still don't have car insurance.
We've had, when I was at FEMA, we had huge meetings with state insurance commissioners about how we could do public education program. Like, we tried everything that we could think of. And it moves the bubble a little bit, right? Generally a big disaster moves the bubble a little bit. But then if you look 5 years later and see if we were able to sustain those coverages, they don't keep these coverages. Once they're looking in the rearview mirror on that disaster, it doesn't matter. So, all right, that's great. Let's see, let's go to the next slide. And then these are just things to think about, right? I don't need to go through these things. I feel like at this point, it's 12:20. You can have these. I'll give them to Dutch. You can send them out, right? I mean, these are just things I think any organization should be thinking about, right? And we've talked about a lot of them. So I'm not gonna bug you all by talking about every single one. But do you have somebody that's looking at this problem in your organization? Doesn't matter whether you're a church, a business, a nonprofit, right? A government entity. Who's responsible for emergency management or continuity, right? Do you have a risk analysis? Do you know where to go to even start that? right? I'd go to these guys first if it were me. You know, do you have a plan, right? Are your employees prepared? Are your employees prepared at home too? Because the reality is if employees are prepared at home, guess what? They'll be better able to support your business during a disaster if they're not worried about their families. So have you done an exercise? So I'll leave you with that list, right? And you know, certainly if you're looking at this as a business or it's a function that you think you've dedicated some time to, but you could do better, right? This is just a good list to kind of get the pump primed about whether you're doing the right things. All right. And I'm happy to take questions, right? I know we're coming up the end. Yes, sir.
So what's that relationship between FEMA and the business during or after an event?
Yeah, let's talk about that, right? Because it's hard to define, right? So there really isn't any, right? A business, a for-profit entity is not an eligible applicant for any FEMA programs, right? So if you're a business and your building is impacted and you have to pay, you have to rebuild that structure, right? You're not going to get money from FEMA, right? Because you're in the private sector. The assumption is you're making money, you're going to be insured appropriately, you need to be able to tackle that. Now, that being said, FEMA does like to, you know, outreach into the business sector because we realize it's good for everybody, right? For all the reasons that we talked about earlier in the brief, but there really isn't any. Now, this is where it comes in with groups like Safeguard Iowa, MPP. What we do is preach that there needs to be a tie-in to emergency management, right? So when we're doing a major event, like a national event like Hurricane Ian, you know, from a FEMA perspective is a national event. They're either affected in Florida or we're pulling resources from the rest of the country. We do stand up the National Business Emergency Operations Center, and there are actually businesses there that bring people into the EOC at FEMA to be able to provide resources and disseminate information out to the national network of businesses. If you could sign up, right? You can go to the FEMA BEOC website and you'll get emails from them and you'll get access to telephone calls during a major event, right? Now you probably don't care, you know, if there's a hurricane in Florida, you know, why would you want to be on a national BEOC call, you know, but it's available to you. I have a one-person consulting business and I'm on their distro. So I get notices that they're going to do a phone call about Hurricane Ian or something else, right? We preach that business emergency operations centers should exist at all levels of government, right? So arguably in this EOC, right, there should be a way for that function, that business integration function should live inside this EOC somewhere, right? It might not be a defined business emergency operations center, right? And we've got a sign and people that come in, but the reality is how are we sustaining communication between the business community and the emergency management agency at that point? And that could occur at a county level. That could also occur at a state level. It also could occur at the FEMA regional level. So if we're handling a major regional event, we might stand up that function inside of our EOC. And the first place we're going to look is to P3s like Safeguard and MPP to help us do that. Right now at FEMA, we're lucky we have full-time support that can stand in and man, you know, staff those parts of the EOC. But at the local and state level, you're looking for the business community to provide those people to do that. You know, it could be virtual. I've seen that happen, but I've also seen it happen inside an EOC. And I think that's where the connection happens, right? But in terms of assistance, financial assistance, you're not going to get some from FEMA. Yes, sir.
In terms of emergency generators, there's obviously different fuel sources. When you were at FEMA, can you talk about what most people did was a diesel, natural gas, propane, dual fuels?
So I'm gonna beg off on that question. I have no idea, frankly.
Okay.
Right?
That's
I think most was general gasoline. You know, FEMA does maintain pre-positioned sets of equipment that on larger disasters would bring in. So say there was a major event in the Des Moines area, right? And a federal disaster declaration was declared. One of the things that the state might do, you know, John Benson's the state director, he might call me as the FEMA regional administrator and say, you know what? Our primary need right now is power. Can you help us get generators, right? We've got some coming in, but I can't get them for 4 days. Can you help? And if approved, FEMA has access down in Fort Worth. There's 4 pre-positioned sites throughout the country where we keep food, water, generators, you know, that kind of thing. We can pull a couple tractor trailers full of generators. I think they're primarily gas, but honestly, okay, right? Not that close to the issue. But
I like when Parkersburg got hit with the tornado.
Yep.
Natural gas station got hit.
Yep.
So they didn't have natural gas, so none of the natural gas generators were working, so they had to bring in substitute generators.
yeah, I never thought about that.
There's those dual, like natural gas, primary to diesel backup.
Yep.
Yeah. Redundancy is good, right? For sure. Okay.
I know we run out of time. Can I ask, just as the host, one quick question?
Yeah, your prerogative. You
If,
paid, well, wait, you did.
if you could water,
Yeah, that's good.
could you just touch on a little bit about the importance of making that coordinated response, don't self-deploy your assets and things like that?
Yeah.
So why this?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we, you know, businesses might self-deploy assets, right? So big event, right? Or any size event. Certainly businesses are going to look out for themselves, right? They have a responsibility to maintain operations, right? We talked about that, essential functions. A lot of times businesses will start, you know, they want to engage, right? If we have a warehouse if we're Walmart, we have a bunch of water, right? We know we want to get water out there into the community. We know they need it, right? Or food or something else, right? I mean, the amount of donations during a disaster is normally significant, right? It's so significant that if the county or the state doesn't have a plan to staff a donations management cell on a large event, you're going to be overwhelmed, right? Because you're just going to have stuff showing up everywhere. But what we absolutely don't want, and it doesn't matter whether it's a nonprofit that wants to get into the emergency management, into the disaster space, or a business or anyone, you know, it's absolutely chaotic, right? To begin with, it's even more chaotic when people are self-deploying and trying to do the right thing. But the problem is if you're not integrated at the city, at the county, at the state level with that emergency management structure, who have a responsibility to know who's providing services, who's in the disaster area, where are those resources going, it lends to the even greater chaos, right? Because if we're doing a water drop somewhere because Walmart knew somebody, right? And so the local Walmart's going to do a water drop over here in this neighborhood. But, you know, AJ and his team have already coordinated a water drop from the state or from the National Guard into that same neighborhood. Now you have, you know, duplicity of resources when you could have gotten twice as much mileage out of those resources, right? So, you know, we say never ever self-deploy, right? But that's another case in point for a business emergency operations center and for businesses in the local community to know who to call, who to contact when they want to do something and when they need information about a disaster. So great question. Thanks, Ben. Absolutely. Yes.
And to follow up on that, so we were saying who to call if you have resources versus self-deploying. Is that Safeguard Iowa through that partnership that you would find that out? I guess who do you, that's where we struggled with. How do we get plugged in? Who do we contact?
Yeah. Ask these two guys, talk to Safeguard Iowa, right? You know, your local emergency management agency is always like the place, right? Now, hopefully I'm not causing extra work for y'all, right? But, you know, there are organizations like Safeguard Iowa that do take some of that off the plate, and they specialize in, you know, working with businesses as part of that collaborative structure, right? And so they can, a lot of what Safeguard Iowa can do is act as a focal point for questions, for communications, right? For taking all that in, and then they can triage those, prioritize them. And then, you know, so instead of getting 1,000 phone calls to these guys, you know, they get one call from Jay saying, hey, I'm getting a lot of questions about this, right? We need to work on this problem because it's a significant concern to the business community, right? And that makes so much more sense, right? All they have to do is call one person and say, we really need water, bad, right? The state is screwing us, right? FEMA said we can't get any, but can someone in the Safeguard Iowa, architecture get us some water, right? And they only have to call one person instead of trying to dial up 50 people.
Just a quick question. Do you have any kind of preferred or suggested case studies for how the private sector can support those kind of efforts? We recently had Principal Financial Group in our security department just joined Safeguard Iowa. So looking for maybe something that's like, hey, how could we apply our resources to something like that?
Yeah, let me think about that. Maybe I could give some feedback to Dutch or to AJ to pass out to y'all. I think one of the more recent examples of an absolute success was not just the flooding here in 2019, but the flooding in Nebraska. And MPP actually set up a BEOC and staffed the state EOC for like 3 or 4 weeks, right? Great case study. One of the slides that I had in my brief was Hy-Vee, right, which is active in this area, but that was actually a relief caravan coordinated through MPP by Hy-Vee that went to an affected area that had been cut off completely for a week without any resupply, food specifically. And all the grocery stores were empty, shelves were empty. And so they worked that all the way through the BEOC, which was MPP, to providers, not just Hy-Vee, but others. They put together this caravan. They coordinated with the National Guard. They got security out of the caravan, and they rolled. As soon as they could get access to that community, they rolled in. It's a great case study. That guide that I mentioned, that FEMA public-private partnership guide, one of the best things about it, and that example is in that book, believe it or not, is they actually have case studies in that book too.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah, even if you just thumb through that book and pick out the case studies, that'd be a pretty good idea.
Awesome, thanks.
Okay, sure. Anything else?
So during COVID, we had an opportunity as a business to help with testing and everything. How, instead of us just giving stuff, but how do we leverage that expertise within a business? That's their main function, or just a site spin on it. How do we create that awareness, or I guess those opportunities that those days?
So awareness, if you're a company that is part of your business, provides services that are necessary during a disaster. In this case,
No. So we do a lot with GMOs, quarantine.
okay.
And it's an easy twist to look at viruses with our system. And so we were able to do 100,000 COVID tests a day.
Wow.
That was in May of 2020.
Yeah.
We had that system up and running, but we had we weren't leveraged very well with it. So how do we get that?
Well, I think, it's kind of a hard answer, but the reality is that by looking at risks, right? And then looking at places that, areas where your company can help, right? So not just risks that you have to overcome as a company, but what are the resources that you have within your company that you might be able to use during a disaster to help the community? That's one for sure, right? And then you have to think about, okay, if I have this thing, how do I make sure that the right people are aware, right? And so, generally I would say it all comes back to the emergency management agency, but in that case, I think it goes back to local public health, right? It goes to state health, right? And getting integrated with those folks on a blue sky day, right? At least so those relationships exist, because that's going to be the thing that saves you during, an event, right? Like, and if, people that are in this business, like in the emergency management business, they're used to doing that, right? In fact, the sharks are always swimming, right? Trying to get pre-event contracts and engage with health, emergency management, right? And I have one foot in that sector, right? But I also remember being a gov, so I could talk about it a little bit, but they're good at that, right? Because those relationships, pre-event relationships, mean revenue to them later on when a disaster happens. But you could think about it the same way, right? Not from a revenue perspective, but what are the resources that you can provide? You know, one of the things that we always wanted to do, we played around with, you know, at FEMA is one of the things we thought would be the best thing for a P3 to do, whether it's a state P3, a regional P3, a localized P3, is to generate a list of resources that were available from all of those businesses that could be used in the event of a disaster, and develop a common framework that would live with the P3 so that, and socialized obviously with state and local emergency management agencies, so that as soon as something happened, you know, you're not having to look at a list of companies and say, hey, I wonder what they can provide. You've got a list and all you do is search a database saying, okay, who do I have in here that committed that they have water? Boom, 40 companies come up, right? And it's all there in a standard format. The state has it, you know, it lives in EOCs, right? It makes things a lot easier.
With that, Paul, we have an information management system that has an inventory of thousands of resources, but I will probably tell you that 90% of them are public sector stuff. It's fire trucks, it's cop cars, it's backhoes, it's K9 teams, it's those kinds of things. So I know we could do much better of doing just what you're suggesting, is having an inventory of private sector resources. Here's the challenge, is that you all know that those resource inventories change hourly, maybe by the minute. And so for us to maintain that becomes impossible. So that there's the secret of how can we distribute the management of that inventory, but have it visible for situational awareness.
Yeah.
And then the key is to have people engaged to take the request and match it up with the offer and do the magic and engage them in the right way. Because I think the other thing was brought up is, take a little bit of a side note, we have great partners here in Central Iowa with media, but they're in the business of primarily providing entertainment to get viewers, and they run news stories, but I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. If they were here, we've talked about this, they want their news stories to be entertaining. And so a lot of people perceive what they see on the media as the actual legitimate countywide needs of a disaster. And the tornado we had last year is a perfect case. We can talk about a pair of pants that we were trying to chase down forever. But there are huge differences in perceived needs versus actual needs. And that's all that system that we're just talking about. It's resources, it's personnel that are engaged in a community to know and sort through and triage the perceived needs from the actual needs. And then it's usually not a shortage of resources. There are cases where it has been, like the PPE, but for the most part, it's how they're distributed and getting those that have the need connected with those that are making the offer. And so, you know, that Safeguard Iowa partnership is who we lean on to be that. And it's not just for, it's a two-way street. It's a conduit of information in, because it provides the EOC situational awareness to make decisions on. But then it's also that information back out, even if it's just a sit rep that you all see and say, okay, now I have validated information, not just a filtered list of social media news that I get on, you know, different sources. So I'm not sure where I'm going with all that, but there's a lot to unpack there. And your entire hour plus with us, Paul, is, you know, spot on. Thank you for doing that. I know your time is valuable and you got places to go, but sincere thank you.
You need to get to, but you know, I do think just one follow on is that even if you're able to get to a point where you realize, you know, who are the potential suppliers of a resource, right? Even if that inventory is not up to date, at least you'll be able to very quickly parse the field, right? Parse the field and understand, okay, there's 5 phone calls I need to make, not 50, right? And then if it's just a problem of, yeah, we don't have any, okay, cross them off the list and go to the next person. That puts you light years ahead of where most people are at. Hell, if you could do the inventory management piece, right, more power to you. That's like PhD level, like emergency management. But just knowing who can provide what is the first step. So
If I could jump in on that just a little bit, and I don't mean to make this a Safeguard Iowa show, but that is one thing that Safeguard Iowa has managed to do is with those couple thousand contacts that they have is inventory what they have, what those businesses have that are available. So with a pretty darn quick search, Jay can actually find out, hey, these several companies have water, these several companies have heavy equipment or whatever that might be. So that is, and we use them in our EOC. If we're activated, Safeguard Iowa definitely has a seat here that we can call on for logistical support and information sharing. So that's a key partner for us.
I know right now, one of the things I'm most excited about with our Homeland Security, state Homeland Security partners is the concept of the Business Emergency Operations Center. Not only having access to the Business Emergency Operations Center, but connectivity on web EOC with all the emergency managers across the state. So that when there's a need that the emergency managers put into web EOC, businesses will be able to see that need as well. And say, I have resources that can address that. We're able to push that forward as a partnership with our public-private sector to address the needs for Iowa. So early planning stages, web EOC is already set up and ready to do that. So as we're moving forward, there'll be more information coming out on that, but I'm excited about that for our state, for all of our partners.
God love web EOC.
There was a comment or question over here with you were the principal.
That's correct.
Yeah, so there has been a program through Safeguard Iowa Partnership to develop EOC liaisons that businesses that have the capacity to do that kind of mutual aid stuff that Paul was talking about, to lend somebody to that system, then can sit as a, not representing principal, but representing the private sector's interest in an EOC, whether it's here in Polk County, it's in Jones County, it's in Adams County, it's the state EOC, that we have ability to get private sector, that perspective from the private sector to have representation side by side in the EOC. That's where the magic happens. If people have the capacity to do that, I know that's something that we'll be talking about a Safeguard Iowa partnership moving forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. Talk some more about it.
Paul, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming. Thank you. I promise. Paul, are you going to stick around for a couple minutes?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
I promised Paul's wife that I'd have him on the road by 1 o'clock, right? So thank you all for coming for the lunch and learn, and appreciate you having here. Please take a moment to fill out the evaluation.